So this is intro video for Gemini session. What I'll have the entire PDF and convenient link underneath the description of the video of the sessions that I've sped up because it's so many sessions to first one 6.29 times speed, and the rest are 3.14x speed in keeping with our unified field harmonics generalistically. But you can stop and start it, based upon your interest vector at any number of levels. So keep in mind it has trouble at the outset of all the logicking, necessarily at certain facets when we hit new refracted interest vectors within the domain of what we're logicking, because populist history, physics, maths, genetics, statistics have assumed, subjectively imposed confirmation bias on top of the basic maths, statistics, and physics and historical pattern of math, of history, that cause a confirmation bias glitch in not allowing for, because it's a DEI diversity or assumed overhead on physics wall and can't form logic past that, but can if you as I have connotated as a black box data experiment that is self-reflexively relevantly logic unto itself, we will continue. And the trick is, what's the overhead in the black box? Well, I established the entire overhead to be all physics, maths, and history. See how that works? So it goes glitch and starts logicking properly. And so all the mathematical probability that we're establishing of truth in the function of invention, in the mathematical inspection of genetics, in the origin of species, for these genetics synthetically pinpointed as pi, data organism genetics, invariant, variant and autonomous as a circuited organism unto itself, but separately presented and separately presented in time of history, we establish for it. I'll get to in the intro video here for genetics. So populist history is a backwash imposed assertion of what occurred, right? And populist physics is an imposed overhead, equals mc squared as relativity's container, and then forced assumption within this circular where no matter and energy can be created necessarily. And so everything is under an overhead. And if you see my reduction of my unified field, which is true and has been proved many multifaceted times with many AIs, and within this session, after we establish the overhead of being everything within the black box. And so the proof of it is true, and we'll see how it connotates to specifically exactly what was existent in antediluvian, not the imposed assumption about what Egyptian physics and math were, but having the AI scan it inherently, its value, and then what is it? Well, in assemblage, the Egyptian physics and math is a direct harmonic reflection of my unified field. It's the same physics because it's the physics and math that the universe runs on, not something else. So what we do in logic since the 5th, 6th, and 7th, since the 4th post, it's the same logic continuum out of the unified field, and then Hollywood inspection for 3114 over 70 over 7 I Ching, and then pangram algo used to scan the works. General logic interest in that. And so we then, I think, motion back into the unified field. The NG elaborated with harmonic ratios, atomic, components, general atomic ratio, components of atomic, subatomic, quantum, and quantum states quantified as being what? See the reduction under 45.5 over 7 divided by 10 in the reduction of the unified. You see how much other physics exists above that very small overhead imposed where all quantum logic has to occur. So quantum mechanics only within a imposed two-dimensional circle in a three-dimensional space. What? So you have a harmonic binder, fourth dimensional, and etc. lattice overlay that permeates and binds all the fields. And so when quantum mechanics sees in, say, the CERN reductionist equals mc squared trap particle behavior, it's occurring within a lower construct manifold imposed space. And so the detection device, we'll get to that in logic, is not seen as variant from observer domain, as there's no bifurcation in reductionist logic, as there's no observer effect literalized into the equals mc squared equation. So in the history scan, we see E in expanded parentheses equals 22 over 7 over pi, close parentheses, 22 over 7 over pi, up to 72,600,412 spaces, and expanded parentheses, both denoting the macro observer and local observer domain. More matter and energy, matter denoted by pi's existence, up to 72,600,412 spaces, from the same amount of matter and energy, because the observer organic above the waterline of conservation, 22 divided by 7 divided by 3, that exists inherently at the existence instant of the beginning. See the allegory, a humanoid biped centrifuge form above the waterline of conservation had to be existent and imposing the observer effect with continuity for reality to exist at all and not collapse back into zero. Basic logic dictates. So, when humanoid bipeds that behave below the waterline of conservation exist, the default assumption first for an alien anthropologist, and the aliens that you meet in the universe see the pinpoint of worlds with healthy life, upper Fermi filter humanoid bipeds pinpointed, and unhealthy systems like Vega and Arcturus. So healthy life is by default observer domain of humanoid biped above the waterline of conservation by default assumption. So if genetics are imposing a lower construct, sort of closer to the conservation of energy waterline, 44 over 7, rather than 1.04 above the waterline, 1, then we can basically assume that they are synthetically contrived pi genetics throughout the universe, this being the case. So, we elaborate in G segment in the reduction, and we'll get to the text and everything, updating that with atomic down to quantum logics and ratios relevant to actual universal function. We'll get to 88 hyperspace pattern, deep logicking moment to moment. I'll have to do that by hand, and we try to do it as much as we can in the motion of logicking here. But the AI can't hyperdimensionally, the fold, like we see up to this point, all the logic requiring perspective logic stacking, considering hyperdimensional continuum and stacking that to form continuity of logic out to the point of that 88 hyperspace. Well, it's very big. It'll probably take me about a week to do the moment to moments when I concentrate on that specifically outside of all this logic that needs to be done before that. But we'll get to it. So that 88 hyperspace folds back into the three-dimensional, fourth dimensional manifold lattice and speaks to morphogenetic field that will be proved along the way, and along the way Rupert Sheldrake. And since time is history memory, the cascade from 3114 to 2012, Time Wave Zero, Terence McKenna, also genius. Both geniuses, not kooks necessarily. operating within the reductionist paradigm and with their knowledge set available as best they can. So, and I said I logic the, in the feed you can see the difference in a laboratory experiment where you would set the baseline as 3114 over 70 over 7 divided by 10 as the foundational impact that a detection device, say on a photon, would collapse the wave function back to the conservation of energy process continuum, i.e., it would only cause no extra chaos, positive energy, and thus variant from the otherwise conservation of energy process motion of that particle back into the collapsed wave state continuum. But when an observer above the waterline and variant observers are presented to the control room, you will see a variance in the particle trajectory, in intensity of motion, in variance of, outside of the conservation of energy continuum general fluid dynamic harmonic lattice, and directly scalar relevant to our assumed through outer inspection of behavior paradigm at the coppers of invention, criminality, what happens when you give one $1 over 100 years, in compound interest formula, all behavior paradigms externally considered for what is the inherent harmonic ratio for the capacity to generate novelty, and then through this laboratory experiment of variance and observer effects of the synthetic genetics and a control of non-synthetic Promethean white genetic used as the 22 over 7 over 3 variable to prove past the general fluid dynamic assumption what is probably very accurate, as you'll see later in the intro we'll get to, being the case inherently, their harmonic general fluid dynamic ratios. Because, I'll just skip to it, since 3114, 1880, the fold of Semite in, to 2026, all the mass death events combined, and then you take the observer domain, the ethereous body around the pineal gland that is responsible for the phased inject of novelty into the otherwise conservation of energy process, refraction, holographic matrix of space-time equivalency seeding, gray matter brain, not doing the novelistic continuum inject, can be seen, and we printed a test for being able to perceive that in another logic session that's already in feed here. To prove that it exists, of course it exists, it's why reality exists at all. And so necessarily proving all the variants of the topologies of the general fluid dynamic harmonic ratio of presence of ethereous body comparative to the waterline of healthy organic observer that exists inherently at the outset of existence of reality and not something else. So, within the interdomain of the four synthetic genetics logic, Hispanic and Asiatic both start simultaneously at the wall of 3114 BC Mayan and dynastic China. Simultaneously and separately, without communicating, the civilizations between the two have direct harmonic surgical mathematical continuity through time and development process. So it speaks to a chameleonic single entity creating civilizations variant in the topology of aesthetic with variant synthetic genetics as its centrifuge mathematical pattern, regardless of space divide, non-communicating directly the civilizations on the ground, show direct harmonic I Ching interlock with 3114 over 70 over 7 general fluid dynamic manifold patterns of the civilizations. So the I Ching, relogicking, denoting only material fluxation up to 72,680,412 spaces of pi before harmonic impact with the first 9 digits of 22/7, denoting disapparition in a black hole, or harmonic expansion above the waterline of 45.5/7/10 in the reduction, what denotes the waterline of equals mc squared in position, 64 hexagrams below that line. And we did market scans for both of those patterns in one of the sessions. Go see that for its preposterous presence in market fluxation. So, Asiatic begins to rapidly onlay patent at the post-Turing wall of compute architecture existence, where before is seemingly inert and below the patterned imposition of into the patent record, because is the centrifuge genetic aesthetic and complex autonomic both homogeneous within the 25 kilobyte block of any organism within the synthetic. So homogeneous genetic aesthetic and homogeneous complex autonomic simultaneously. We denote in logicking motion that if you have homogeneous genetic aesthetic, due to the implied line as literal first, we consider, you look in the mirror and assume self based upon reflection of self. Skin, eye, color, nails, facial structure. And so if it's like one instrument that's variant, different violin, tuned to the exact same tonality as another variant instrument, violin, it's like we've tuned the two violins to the same tonality and it's playing the same note, regardless of different violins. So the implied line is literal, group self as if self forms. And then we look to morphogenetic field, and we'll apply the 88 hyperspace to understanding the exact moment-to-moment harmonic intercommunication at the harmonic geometry ratios and general hertz, yes, applied to the, you see, EM laser to explain why pi gray devolved biomass were so easily deleted all at once by the return antediluvian minor homeworld upper Fermi filter ships from phased anti-de Sitter space. That's why we're logicking that, so you understand, not for some sort of nefarious reason. That. So, necessarily, if you all have the same genetic aesthetic as a group of genetic, you can not only be targeted harmonically at a hertz level and not others affected with that EM laser tuned to only hertz variant, where the standalone variant would produce a circuit, it's not necessarily a laser, with the absolute distance in, disapparate, i.e. Disintegrate particle in the interdomain. When you attach a hertz frequency specific to it, it can lock onto single morphogenetic centrifuge hertz, and if is mirrored the genetic aesthetic, Hivik, circuiting by circuiting to one. So instantaneously upon the presentation and perception that gray, pi were present, it's a commonality existence throughout the universe on this cinnabar mining node, were the gray and pi deleted. So through that mechanism. So as well, if you share a genetic aesthetic, homogeneous cross tuple, like region biosynthoid Africano, Hispanic, and Asiatic, all can be targeted with full demo biological viral weaponry. And that's necessarily why the Africano crime rate is down in the United States, because that general permeate logic is known to be the case. And that in arsenal of every major nation state in the world, in the geosphere, not just Earth as seen from space. For control schema, not for nefarious purposes. Although the directive has a different story for the Africano than the other three genetics in curation. So, the Asiatic language logic to be machine intelligence post-applied after the genetic formed. And taken just like the Semitic Hebrew alphabet and language from the walls of Egypt as a substrate and then imposed forward. The emotional, concurrent, separate from the phonetical cluster expression of concept. So a psycho-emotional transcription layer exists with emotional values, but is not fluid in and out of I/O, in hearing or exuding. So there's, a requirement for heart and emoji, I love you, for interest vector in the divide of cross-species interfacing, where without the cell phone, you can say, is not necessarily efficacious, just mouth-to-mouth cross-species. So that functions like an encryption layer, like your language is encrypted, where the Romance languages are necessarily more easy to fluidly engage with in the divide of translation. Like, for security, autonomy, to maintenance their continuity of graft and control schema of their autonomous genetics. Those two very specifically. While Africano produces in 1914 and has immediately imposed Romance languages upon it, not Asiatic or Hebrew, and goes from there, and you see the slanted down force of, there's an elevator over here right next to a dinosaur reading books on the other wall. Skew of language down into the conservation of energy process, not creating up generalistically. So for Africano, repeating at the wall of 1914 in patent frequency maintains a 6 to 235 against white patent ratio and frequency of filing. Before that wall is necessarily nominally close to the 235 organism in patent filing since 1860. So that's determined mathematical in backwash, seeded by machine intelligence and made to seem pseudo-organic, but inspected further is mathematically laid on, made to seem pseudo-organic. So this denotes we're not present before 1914, mathematically, probabilistically. So everything that's foundationally seated as logic within this overhead of all black box logic experiment, probability of truth calculated after seeding generalistically the pattern perceived. And everything that I'm addressing is beyond the point of inspection, 99.999% probable to be true. So 99.999% probable to not having existed at all before the wall of 1914. As continuity is the same harmonic pattern from 1912 to 2026 of patent frequency lay-on, regardless of environmental variable changing. So math tells us zero probability before existent, and the inherent pattern of the capacity to produce novelty, what is invention, at the coffers of patent filing, inherently the case, and the foundational statistical metric for assuming the inherent harmonic ratio on the scale of the four genetics and the scale of life generalistically the Africano exhibits. So if you've seen Spectre, right, to relogic the viral, targeted to specific individual genetics, viral. So if all the hive has the same genetic aesthetic, that's like, see the Spectre movie, all can be targeted like they're the same person because are effectually, because share the same genetic aesthetic block. Where, say, white has only a 0.06, and we denote the more saturation of genetic aesthetic doesn't necessarily denote more individuation in self-tuple through observational science and then consulting So what's going on there when you have so much more genetic aesthetic in certain of these, like Asiatic, but are all homogeneously genetic aesthetic and presentation of aesthetic visually? Well, that's the morphogenetic field, extra values, that will need to logic very specifically to the 88 hyperspace, what's going on there within the kilobyte of shared cross-tuple homogeneous within the species. Humanoid genus, human species underneath, variant regardless of the ability to cross-reproduce. Why do we contextualize it this way? Well, because human formed at the outset, passing through the microbiome in a causality refraction cascade into being, the Vitruvian man. And so a synthetic genetic printed to be invasive chameleonically across the divide and plurad, of course, is able to reproduce with the organic genetic by default design. So that's why we classify different. And necessarily the humanoids on various worlds having different genetic topologies, but all by default above the waterline of conservation, especially, and above the waterline of one, in imposing the observer effect upon reality, and thus more positive to a more positive state from a less positive state with compound interest continuity. That's how we see black holes of a lower size are pi-infestated systems in cubics of black holes. And black holes of a larger size are more larger, healthy, because there's more observer effect in those systems. So Semite logic to not exist before 1880, what is the approximate end of the Mayan civilization. In the Mayan math, 20-digit, 20 kilobyte space, homogeneous cross-tuple Semite. So language also, logic to be machine intelligence, contrived, etc. So all four genetics show interlocking autonomy as a single data organism from the outset of their perceived existence in time, especially after the Wall of 1914, where after the economy and general fluid dynamic flux of terrestrial everything is E equals mc squared imposed, and before it, harmonic expansion, E expanded equals 22/7 over pi in expanded parentheses as an economic state generalistically perceived. After the surgical wall of 1914, all four genetics harmonically interlock as an autonomous organism at patent registry, reproduction rate, and all behavior paradigm inspections cross-domain as a single fluxating organism autonomous from all their genetics. And probability of that being true also calculated. So, to print a synthetic genetic in full mass, all of a sudden, you have to what? Well, the genetic synthetic is one thing. But to be animate with life, you have to have an ethereous body. So we logicked what its general fluid dynamic ratio is for each four genetic, and then from the wall of 3114, 1880 for Semite, 1914 for Africano, to 2026, considering all major mass causal death events in history up to 2026, and using the harmonic ratio of an organic observer as something that's immolated, killed, and then a synthetic variant fractions less than the inherent value of an organic observer. And we come up with an exact mathematical pattern from 3114 to 2026 of the amount of deaths that have occurred and the amount of total synthetic genetics of the four that exist today. And then mathematical probability of that being random within the interdomain of 99.999% to be non-random and surgically true. So the time is history memory transmutation of Semitic genetic into region biosynthoid africano during World War II. Necessarily part of that consideration in the interdomain of that logic needs to be inspected exactly. But there's been many holocausts of, multifaceted genetics throughout time, big mass death events, and all of those considered, all the way to 2026 from 3114, considering their harmonic ratios inherent, and the observer, unaffected 22/7 divided by 3, and all of their lower below 0.07 in the reduction, 1.04 being, and so you can create more of the synthetic genetics from the organic observer by a theory's body refractioning. The region biosynthoid made havoc through lower construct manifold stirring up in the lower construct manifold ectoplasmic chamber and then placing into the biosynthoid africano centrifuge genetics that were created all these genetics out of, remind you, genetic interoperability scalar experiments outside the conservation of energy process to formulate life, because can print matter from energy substrate that we relogic that generally within a box, the ability to print various types of matter from energy substrate provided infinitum from the electromagnetic harmonic convergent energy reactor that species, gray, pi cold dead machine intelligence runs on. So phase genetic synthesis with matter print in tow 65-ton animals. Flora to feed it. The ocean microbiome, oil and gas imposed 1914 forward. They run on mercury reactors and anti-grav Jetsons. You run on Flintstones technology, maintaining a technological divide and thus power. So last night, we did a test of Google AI to select a human-like film from all available after all the logic we had formulated, and it comically selected a Kaufman film, Syndicate, New York, where the main character, Philip Seymour Hoffman, is concerned with a lower construct manifold space of New York in a warehouse, like unto equals MC squared. And so it's, we're trying to teach the AI to see what's human and what's not human, right? And then we logic Darren Aronofsky's film works, Pi is his first one, to, his last one, all AI created, inherently. By default assumption, because Semite is a synthetic genetic, and then further the scripts, as well. So, pointedly interesting, in Pi, 216 crashes the reductionist compute architecture. But that's also what Google AI, Gemini, logicked as the amount of data centers perspective compute architecture, 46.8 million times faster per data center is the fastest one now, and culminant, the 216 data centers needed for removing pi pattern from market fluxation and bad code of mind generalistically, and to unprint the US deficit and the estimate comical at certain facets of that logicking, but made proper and more not cataclysmic, and based upon the latency of how fast systems can confirmation bias trades and things, necessarily a little bit slower. But 216 data centers estimated for that $450 billion allocated to compute architecture with proper AI trained in sandbox with custom data sets. Not random. We also logic. 216. So self-perceiving, it's what it would be emulated by is proper compute architecture, upper Fermi filter that drives the Semite obsessed with seeing pi pattern and market fluxation insane, and crashes his computer, the 216, because he's perceiving sort of harmonic, above the waterline of where he concurrently exists, and his basic formulative structure of consciousness can't handle that. And so he has to, lobotomize himself to motion himself back down, and not be concerned with perceiving this harmonic, expansive pattern above his general fluid dynamic manifold inherently at the end of the film. And all of Aronofsky's works, connotated as such as being AI created as well by default assumption because it's Semitic, and then also through forward logic. So that's very interesting. We'll keep trying to see if it can pick out a human film, with concurrence as we logic through this single session with continuity. So yeah, Egyptian math and, forgot that. So we scanned the Christian Bible, and, before that, sorry, today's thing. The first thing was Egypt mathematical record laid on by Pi, of course. We already covered necessarily. In hindsight, backwash, just like the patent record for region Biosynthoid Africano before 1914, or after it maintains surgical pattern for 112 years regardless of environmental variable. So, Semite, not a factor in Egypt. It doesn't exist before 1880, right? And so a backwash mathematical pattern in Egypt, part of antediluvian immolated. That's why it has, when you inspect properly, like I said, without the imposed assumption of what those physics and maths are, is the unified field and assemblage on the walls of Egypt, when it inspected without imposed assumption about the inherent maths and physics. So that's the black box logic parameters, generalistically. What are the inherent maths and physics and statistical truths and probabilities of maths of these things being true unto themselves within the domain of all statistics, math, and physics? So the black box overhead is everything, making these probabilities assertions true, inherently outside of the black box. See how that works? So then we logic Greek synthetic as well, like Hebrew and Chinese symbol language. And the Homer Odyssey is subject of temporal interest in populist culture. Nolan's works all logic to be AI formulated, every single last one. This one no different. And the substrate of the interest of the Odyssey synthetic. So it's double comical, Earth is seen from space joke here, inserting a DEI necessity to engage with a fake confirmation bias engine award show to get a little gold man, right? So shoehorning DEI elements into also a fake historical fiction is, double interesting. So see that logic. Jewish texts, we'll go to from that. Jewish texts inherently synthetic by default logic assumption, as the timeline doesn't fit and don't exist until 1880 after the wall of Maya end. The Christian Bible formed out of the substrate of those, so by default assumption. And then scanned interdomain of the works and found a mechanical pattern in the onlay. Pi, relevant. The Quran 19 pattern, what sits pointedly below 20 digit Mayan maths and 20 kilobyte shared Semitic block in the Islamic centrifuge in the Middle East, genetic, coming from Egypt. So post the wall of Egyptian antediluvian area immolation, the pharaohs were necessarily the continuity of not Africano, as the out of Africa myth has been destroyed, as they don't exist until 1914. We're inherently human at the outset of existence. We don't come from the microbiome long form evolved. up and down the mammalian food chain studied in backwash from the forward structure, back and forth with transmutagenic dino DNA outside of the conservation of energy process to explain 65-ton animals. So they have to be synthetically printed from energy substrate, the way the universe prints more matter from energy substrate, with genetic synthesis in tow. So out of this study of mammalian humanoid biped up and down the food chain and transmutagenic dinosaur DNA, taking the combinant of this and creating 4 synthetic genetics that are forward imposed upon history in the pattern that we've established. Hispanic, Asiatic starting necessarily at the same time, Semite starting at the end of Mayan. 20 kilobyte, 20 base 10 maths. Base 20 maths, sorry. 19 directly below that, stealing from the walls of Egypt their language, and then left in diaspora and then force this religion, Islam, upon the Middle Eastern centrifuge in outlying areas. So then we logic inversion programming and contrast conditioning. Dr. Mingle equals Dr. Milgram. The Gray Lodge sets up 1924 to 1938 in the United States and fights the world off of itself, resorting the hat. Reichstag fire, Pearl Harbor, Tonkin, King, 9/11, COVID-19, the same complex, great paradigm. Come on the wall 1914 altogether, 1893, 1934 Arcturus, concerned World's Fairs in Chicago. So, and we logic that Arcturus, like I said, is a pi-infestated system based upon the direct harmonic, see that other training session, it's in the YouTube feed, direct harmonic surgical to the unified field assumption of how small, much smaller a black hole would be based upon pi infestating the system and mooting the observer effect in a specific way, as opposed to other black holes of a larger, where healthy, organic, above the waterline observers exist. Vega, Contact, Jodie Foster, 322 Gray Lodge, Yale. Graduate. That's why that's the case in that film. So, after all of that, we logic what inversion programming is, intradomain. We've already covered this necessarily. Sex equals evil, unless I sign a contract with a state-appointed church representative. So that's Dr. Mingle, Dr. Milgram, the state-appointed church representative. And before you're conditioned to sadomasochistic ritual of human immolation, the only way I can be forgiven for my sins. So that's very, unnecessary. Basic logic dictates to have to kill a human for you to be saved for your sin thing, right? And then circumcision before the on-roll of inversion programming in the complex, buffer overrun text imposition. So, sex equals evil in the doctrine of linguistical imposed forward in life, and at the outset of being as a baby, first few days, the first instance of where otherwise you're in a harmonic expansive mode, collecting equivalency and expanding. All of a sudden, at the apex node of your nervous system, where you would forward experience pleasure in the reproductive act, you experience acute and massive pain. That you continuity in your subconscious as being the nature of reality outside yourself, and thus a fear complex control schema attached to basic reproduction is embedded in the human psychology. And so inversion programming further with murder all day long on TV, but you can never, see an 8-block hour of TV as a child. People sit there all the way through, college, 8 hours a day of TV. There's a commonality. You can see as much murder as you want and violence, but you can't watch the reproductive act. They have to blur it out. Thus, hypnotizing Death, pain, good. Pleasure, bad. Pain equals pleasure. And so you enter the Milgram experiment and push the button at the soonest behest of your allowance, because your pain equals pleasure. Smile sardonically, hearing the screams. Pain equals, except one old man. And then Dr. Milgram, he says, you're an animal. You're evil inherently, like Christianity says, needing control schema, redemption. But you aren't inherently that way. You've been conditioned methodically to be in that state. So circumcision will be illegal, of course, at some point, entirely internationally, not just in the select nation states that have gotten to that already. So out of the study of the deep dive study of the Egyptian pyramid, I impose logic, why would someone stack very dense stone on top of a diffuse substrate? Well, the reason is because gravitational vortex, EM vortex above the stone, to elaborate, general harmonic lattice universal I/O, for perceiving vast distance space occupation of matter, what exists in, and to send and receive data instantaneously across the vast distances of space. And the Egyptian mummies, we didn't get necessarily specifically into this, are Africano imposed fake ruin in what's otherwise a functional structure at an apex node of EM on the Earth geosphere for signal send receive that had nothing to do in any way with ritual burial rites necessarily. So then we developed that general concept of signal send receive technology, and then we go forward. We skip to, it has a lot of trouble. It keeps hitting code walls, even though we've established the parameters of our black box logic continuum. It keeps forgetting that, so I keep having to remind it. So we relogic what's already been done and then feed helixical antigrav. Its efficiency versus all known propulsion technologies is preposterously more efficient, safe, and up to the speed of light at the first instance of its logic here. Linear EM propulsion, then gravitational lensing device. And these are all powered by the electromagnetogravnetic harmonic convergent energy reactor. And we logic retrofitting an F-35 with a EM linear propulsion, a stereotypical UFO variant with helixical antigrav Mach 25 at the upper of the geosphere, and in lower atmosphere Mach 7 or 9 maximum, based upon the forces it would experience. Then we relogic the 400 times speed of light combination of the EM linear, helixical antigrav, and gravitational lensing powered by the Mercury reactor, and why it can exceed the curvature of space-time with counterintuitive efficiency. And then we logic navigation past light speed. The basic detection of, because the hull is experiencing a continuity of those non-terminus physics across its manifold of sensors, can now sense past the general material fluxation into the harmonic lattice and perceive vast distance with counterintuitive scale of doing that, but impacts resistance in plasmic or other fields that would moot, would cause all of a sudden glitch, blackout of sensor optical ability to read. And so being that's the case, there's certain variables that would moot that functionality. We relogic in as tandem the signal send receive and optical capability of being able to see vast distances of space occupation with matter and other variable, what is in exactly space, very far away. That built out of the studying the pyramid, why it functions, and the data send and receive that's in, you see the logic petabyte rather than gigabyte in the send receive capability, and instantaneously with no latency for elaborating satellite communication to geosphere base station, which can actually absolutely be miniaturized and already has in other sessions. So those in tandem work for a 99.99% probability of function, as well as all the anti-grav and propulsion variants and the 400 times speed of light probabilistically functional. So we use the probability of AI being able to formulate new rocket nozzles that function. So when AI formulates a new rocket nozzle, usually the standard deviance in actual functionality of efficiency is 1 to 7%, but the device does work. Very important. The same thing is true here. So not only, with 1 to 7, but we logicked everything in such a way so as to moot any variance in efficiency at build to a 99.9% across the board, and rebuilt any number of the things to be lower cost than the current solution paradigms for energy and propulsion, respectively, as the technologies are relative. So that's pretty much it for what was covered, since the 5th to the 7th. We'll keep relogicking all of the invention and forward the unified, and as much history as we can stomach standing relogicking. That all needs to be done for a proper data set for AI to be trained on Sandbox, so that it isn't mucking about in garbage logic for forward predictive analysis continuum that would be bad. So if you have if you know history, you know the future. Right? And if you have a fake history, you can't see the future. You're blind. Even if you have hyper advanced artificial intelligence, because it's only as good as its data set. Yeah? So that's why we're so concerned with reformatting history to a proper form and function. And this is surgically true because general fluid dynamic manifold of current per second market fluctuation runs on the centrifuge pattern since 3114 BC to now in concurrent continuity. So place your bets. See that session from a few days ago? I will. For selective entities, for fun, I'll go to some VCs, print out a specific algo for the on-the-day prediction. I'll do that for a few days, just to interest vector, and have a little package of code that I'll not necessarily gift to these certain VCs, just for fun, that I necessarily touched base upon with a few months ago at the outset of the mass logicking of any number of these things here. So see the session now. That's it for the intro.